My name is Darren Gawle. I am 42 years old. I've been living in Vancouver for about 25 years now, and currently I have a radio show on CiTR, which is UBC's campus radio. So anyway, being the age I am, grew up in the 80s. Vinyl was still big then. It was vinyl and cassettes. CDs hadn't hit the market yet. 8-tracks had pretty much gone by the wayside at that point. And, you know, you go into, I mean, it was very early memories. I was raised on music because my dad he'd been a jazz musician in the 60s, and he had a gigantic jazz record collection. So vinyl, there was a lot of vinyl around the house. So it was familiar to me. And, you know, when you go out with my parents, even when I was a kid, I'd be dragged along to, like, you know, they'd have like the record section at, for example, Sears or Eaton's or Simpsons or whatever. And it was just this world of things that I didn't understand. These like discs that came in a cardboard sleeve with pictures on them. And, you know, you knew that there was music on it because I'd been listening to music, you know, by that point with stuff that my parents would play. But, you know, there was this whole world of other things, like what's this Bob Marley guy? Or why does this Iron Maiden band have scary pictures on the cover, you know, being that young? And it wasn't until later on, like I remember the first thing I ever bought was, I took money I'd made mowing lawns and I went out to they had a record store. Growing up in Montreal, they had in the West Island, there was a record store called Discus, which was out in West Island Mall. And you go in there and it's, what did I do? Oh, I went in and bought Revolver by the Beatles for $10. And that was what started. That was the first record I actually bought with my own money. And, you know, from that point on, you'd have these commercial record stores in, you know, in the malls, things like A&A Records and Tapes. You had Music World, there was stuff like that. And then I discovered Sam the Record Man in downtown Montreal, which is like 3 stories of vinyl. And you go in there and, you know, like there's this whole new world of stuff that had opened up. You weren't like slave to whatever this mall owner or this mall sort of music store or, sorry, record store owner had space to put on display. There was like, you know, floor after floor of stuff. You could go in, it was like, oh, and then there was import. You go in and all of a sudden there were these mysterious records that cost more, and they were import, and things like that. But I started to get into older music. Like I started to get into prog and 60s stuff, and it was hard to find because if you went to a big, you know, a chain record store, they would get what was going to sell. So you're pretty much at the mercy of what was, you know, a new release or what had been reissued. And some friends of mine at school who knew that I was into that sort of music had suggested that I go to this place called Cheap Thrills. And now, back in the day, they had an outlet in Montreal on Bishop Street. And they had another storefront, but I can't remember where it was. I don't know if it was the current location on Metcalf. But, you know, some friends of mine said, "Oh, you got to go to Cheap Thrills. You know, if you want to spend a lot of money on records and get a lot of records, rather than spend a lot of money on records and come out with like a couple of records, go to Cheap Thrills because they sell secondhand." And this was like this magical concept to me. I'd never even considered it, like secondhand records. You can do that. You can buy a record that somebody else has like used. So I would go in there, and, you know, from West Island Montreal to downtown, it was quite a trek on the metro and the bus. So you get on the bus, and you go down to downtown Montreal, and you go up Bishop Street, and you go up to the second floor, and you walk into Cheap Thrills, and all of a sudden it was like, you know, Howard Carter discovering Tutankhamun's tomb. It was just this world of records all over the place, and it's like, you know, like, what is this thing that I've just found? And you go through the bins, and it was like everything you were looking for, you know, you could find, and it was, you know, like $3, $5, all these magical records that you'd heard of and you wanted to get, all of a sudden were at your, you know, the world was at your feet. You had this store where you could actually find what you were looking for. And so I started going down. I'd go down there about once a week and start buying things, and I'd be buying Genesis and Jimi Hendrix and things like that. And I got really into the Yardbirds, and one day the guy behind the counter who had seen me come in, he was going like, well, actually what I'll do is I'll start, because I brought it. And the guy behind the counter basically started noticing what I was buying, and he says, well, I notice you like the Yardbirds. Why don't you try this band out? And this is a band called The Creeps. They were from Sweden. They were around for about 3 albums. I think they bought this in about '88. But this was like all of a sudden you'd been invited to hang out with the cool kids. There was something that it wasn't just looking for stuff that everybody knew about. All of a sudden, it was like, all of a sudden I was like ahead of the game for the first time in my life. So I owe it to them to put me on the path to actually discovering, independent, not just independent record stores, but also independent music. I think this is the other thing that, one of the things that matters to me about vinyl is that you get the full effect for cover art. You've got this palette of 12 inches by 12 inches where an artist can actually do something that you can focus in on and you can see it across the room. And I think we definitely lost that with the compact disc. All of a sudden, like cassettes were just tiny things, and you'd have like all this effort that went into something aesthetically pleasing, all of a sudden got compressed, down to like whatever the size of a CD is. I think it's like 4 inches by 4 inches or something like that. But yeah, that's definitely why vinyl matters a lot to me, especially from, particularly from a design standpoint, is you've got something, like art print size that you can frame if it was that good, and there was a lot of room to work with, and there's so much detail. And yeah, I mean, so CDs don't scratch, but at the same time, there's this whole aesthetic that was lost when we all went over to buying CDs, and it's definitely been lost now that the MP3 has come along.